Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, April 3rd, 2026. I'm re-recording the vlog because the last one came out looking a little bit strange. But before we get started, if you like the content and you want to support the channel, please consider hitting the like, subscribe, and alert bells. Before you go, maybe share with a friend. So this is part 3 of a mini-series that I'm doing on what happens when we die. And if you've seen the first 2 installments, I hope you're convinced that we know a great deal about the physical processes associated with biological death, and specifically in humans, and that's cause for optimism. We all age continually, which is to say that we are all changing continually. And I've argued that our lives and who we are more of a process that unfolds over time rather than a fixed quantity that just exists as is. And ultimately, entropy wins out. We cease to exist in our current configuration. And that's actually a good thing. So if we're being honest, we all recognize that we only have a limited amount of time on the planet in this form, that the unique arrangement of atoms that comprise each of us will eventually disperse under the entropic forces of the universe. All that order eventually yields to disorder. Okay? But here's the catch. At the cellular level, much of our organic material gets recycled back into the nutrients and the fuel and energy that help create and sustain all kinds of other forms of life as our bodies decompose. And at the atomic level, none of our literally several octillion atoms are ever lost. The atoms are just reclaimed by the cosmos. We are born of the universe, and that's where we inevitably will return. We just move on to the next phase of existence. Yet at the same time, death is an absolutely vital recycling process for the cosmos. And that's why I genuinely view death as a good thing. A necessary part of life, and not the opposite of life. All of us, even the most selfish among us, do something remarkably generous by dying. We pave the way for others to live, both within and certainly far beyond our own species. And so that's the physics of life and death in a nutshell. But here's where the story gets even more complicated. If you accept the arguments about our physical selves and decomposition, you can still ask, well, what happens to the sense of ourselves, our consciousness in particular, especially after we die? And that's a tough question, and it's one that we can't answer empirically, currently, with any scientific methodology with which I'm familiar. And so now we have to move into the realm of more pure speculation rather than certainty. Physics and biology at present cannot answer the question of what it feels like to be you or your awareness of your own subjective experience. We have a sense that consciousness must somehow be related to our brain's activities and the neural networks, etc., but we don't know exactly how. We also know that consciousness requires energy and information processing. But again, we don't know why all of this brain activity should produce anything specific, or why we should feel anything specific, including the awareness of our very selves. So that's our challenge, and this is perhaps most famously described as the hard problem of consciousness, as introduced by the philosopher and cognitive scientist David Chalmers back in 1995. So the hard problem refers to the challenge of explaining how and why subjective experience arises from physical processes in the brain. While we understand much more about the neural correlates of consciousness and the cognitive processes involved in awareness, the question of, again, how and why these processes give rise to the rich inner world of subjective experience remains unresolved. All we know with reasonable certainty at this point is that human consciousness depends on the synapses and the neurotransmitters that are firing in our brains. We know a lot about what Chalmers described as the so-called easy problems of consciousness, such as how the brain processes information, which parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of that processing, and so on. The hard problem is why any of this feels like anything to us. In other words, why we have the experience of awareness. And there's a fundamental gap then between the mechanisms of our neurocircuitry and the experience of being self-conscious, being aware. And so that's the hard problem. It's also, I think, fundamental to our understanding of what happens to us when we die. And so, surprise, we don't have a definitive answer. So again, that's where religion and foundational beliefs within each culture sort of step in to fill in the void. And if you're skeptical in that regard, I really don't blame you. The easy path probably would be to just simply accept, right, whatever your culture or your religion teaches you. And that can be quite comforting. Again, let me be clear. I'm not here and I cannot evaluate the religious claims at our disposal, at least not while wearing my professional hat as a behavioral scientist. So here's what I want to simply suggest instead. That is, from the perspective of neuroscience, consciousness is an emergent property of the complex arrangements of the atoms that comprise our neurocircuitry, the neurocircuitry of our brain as housed within these physical bodies. But it's always a relational issue. That is to say that there's no single neuron that produces consciousness, nor does any single segment of the DNA. Right? So as best we can tell, consciousness is the byproduct of the billions of neurons in your brain working together. It's a lot like a computer program that has all of these different bits of information, instructions, and algorithms that together generate the output that we're able to observe, assuming we have, again, the basic hardware in place and the structures, and etc., and electricity. We're then essentially taking these billions of neurons, wiring them together using trillions of synapses, and voila, we have consciousness. So, and then we have this inner world and a sense of self that emerges. And so that's the dominant view of modern neuroscience. And we can actually then show how damage to specific regions of the brain, for example, change or even can destroy specific aspects of selfhood. So, for example, I have one brother, let's call him Lazarus, who suffered a major heart attack and died while waiting in the ER. They were unable to intubate him at the time, and he was clinically dead for something like 20 minutes. Miraculously, though, he survived through the miracles of modern medicine. They were able to get his heart started again. They cooled his body down through a process known as therapeutic hypothermia. He induced a coma for about a week and then brought him back. And he lived. And he's still alive now, almost 20 years later. So that's incredible. But here's the thing. Parts of the brain were damaged from the oxygen deprivation that he'd suffered, again, during this prolonged near-death experience. His hippocampus, for example, suffered irreparable damage. And so he struggles then with short-term memory and various other problems. Is he still the same person? Is he the same Lazarus 20 years ago? Or in the words of Gautier, someone that I used to know? Well, in some respects, yes, but his functional capacities have changed, and his personality has changed in certain respects as well. But guess what? My functional capacities and personality have changed some as well, at least in the last 20 years. And perhaps for different reasons. But both of us and all of you are different today than we were 20 years ago due to the entropic processes associated with aging, at the very least. The main difference is that in Lazarus's case, he also suffered a traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And so in that sense, Lazarus has changed more? Well, probably. But in any event, the narrative thread that makes each of us our specific selves is usually fairly coherent. But people who've suffered TBIs or have other neurological or cognitive deficits might struggle a bit, or at least a bit more, in terms of the construction of that self. So what's my point in all of this? Well, that all of us, at least at one level, need the appropriate neurological scaffolding, the substrate that allows for us to exist as conscious, self-aware beings. If you remove or destroy that substrate, you destroy the sense of self, as far as we know. And then if you do have the scaffolding in place, then our cultures, fill in all the additional pieces of information that allow us then to develop language, to form the specific thoughts and memories that we eventually do, and to communicate all of this with the rest of the world. And yet, of course, we're still left wondering why. We know about the brain architecture, how this allows me to produce a YouTube video, for example, upload the content, and then how you're able to watch and listen, react, etc. We understand the mechanisms. We just don't truly understand why the brain allows us to develop the awareness of the self. And so does the rock, for example, experience awareness of the self or the planet as a whole? Usually, or most people will say no, because they lack the necessary neurocircuitry. But even if you accept that neurocircuitry is required to be a conscious living entity, we still don't know exactly how that circuitry works to allow for the emergence of consciousness. And so some, like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, argue that consciousness arises from the countless quantum computations that occur inside protein structures within neurons called microtubules. The processing of the quantum information then leads to discrete moments of conscious awareness when the wave function collapses. So it's an interesting, albeit speculative, argument. But who knows? What I find most interesting is that maybe it's not that consciousness is somehow this separate thing that emerges within each of us based on the fact that all of our cylinders are firing properly. Maybe our brains just allow us to connect with something much deeper that's always been there and woven into the fabric of space-time itself. So think about that. Okay? Again, this is more speculative, obviously, on my part, but here's the logic. All matter and energy that exist today have always existed in the universe, but just in different forms and configurations over the last 13.8 billion years, perhaps longer. Among the infinite possibilities and defying all statistical odds, here we are, you and me and we and all of us. We are in these particular temporary or changing forms for perhaps 100 years, maybe slightly longer if we're lucky. But 100 years is quite the goal. Only a fraction of 1% even attain or live to the year 100. People like Dick Van Dyke. Fun fact, he's now over 100. He just turned 100 in December, but his wife's actually 2 years younger than my wife. So maybe that's the key to longevity, right? Roughly the equivalence of me marrying somebody like a first-year university student of mine, or actually more, even a high school senior. Can't even imagine. But anyway, I digress. The truly fascinating idea here is not a new one, but rather reflects the logic of something called panpsychism. And this is the idea that consciousness, mind, or soul is a foundational and ubiquitous feature of all physical reality. So again, let me explain. All matter and energy exist in a state of constant motion and change. We live in a vibrating universe with matter and particles that oscillate constantly at different frequencies due to thermal energy. Basically, matter can be described as energy vibrating at specific frequencies, creating the underlying quantum fields that then fill in the universe with experience. Everything in space-time that's comprised there within. And so we as people then are comprised of matter and energy too, in our specific configurations and locations in space-time. We just happen to be more complex configurations than, say, the composition of rocks, or if you drill down further, if you look at the ubiquitous molecules in atoms. And so from a panpsychic perspective, even the basic constituents of matter, such as electrons and quarks, contain some or possess some kind of experience, an experiential reality. At the very least, the building blocks to reality are these particles that stand together in various field configurations. And so I'm of the view myself, personally, that yes, every system has some degree of consciousness, for lack of a better term. It's not that an electron, for example, has the same intelligence or feelings that we have as humans. I don't believe that. Rather, that everything, though, has some type of experience, a reality driven by the fact that whatever it is, it has a physical manifestation of light and energy, always in motion. So no, I can't talk to a chair and have an intelligent conversation, and the chair doesn't talk back to me, at least in any way that I can understand. But many peoples and cultures have looked at the world through this kind of a lens, long before we developed formal science. So the idea is that everything exists then in different configurations, and thus manifests certainly motion and movement and energy and vibrations, and dare I say consciousness, in different ways. And so yes, certainly trees then are conscious too in some senses, and might even feel pain. Research seems to suggest that to be the case. And then as we ramp up complexity, don't we quite naturally start attributing consciousness to other entities, especially those forms of life that we believe have central nerve, or that we designate as having central nervous systems? In other words, doesn't your cat or your dog have some level of conscious awareness? I think all of us would say absolutely. And certainly they feel pain too, right? And they communicate all of this with us. And so at that level, most of us then are quite comfortable acknowledging that animals must have some type of consciousness as well. And so maybe the best way to think about consciousness then is to equate it with information. Maybe we should take quite seriously and literally the physicist John Wheeler's notion of it from bit, meaning that all physical matter and energy, the it of the universe, derives its existence from information. And all information can be reduced to a series of binary choices or yes/no questions, the bit. In short, all reality is inherently informational and always in motion, I would add. So we as observers then play a crucial role in bringing reality into being. And due to our luck and our privilege, if you will, of emergent complexity, we can sense reality in a variety of different ways and process information in some instances in unique ways, at least compared to other animals. And then coolest of all, we can share that sense of reality and communicate it with other beings. And of course, that's what we do, again, for at least about 100 years, if we're that lucky. We consume and communicate information about reality in all of its complexity. We study the physics and the chemistry to talk about the subatomic particles that exist, or everything from those to whole galaxies moving across the cosmos. And we study, of course, biology and life, from simple-celled or single-celled organisms to the most complex forms that we know of, and so much more. And in all of this, we find ourselves then living amongst and working with all kinds of different information and matter in these different arrangements. We might, for example, carry around special rocks in our pockets, or rub them together for their energy, or otherwise extract information from the rocks. Or we might just carry back from the shore a few seashells, especially for their beauty. But whatever our motivations, we're quite aware that there are these so many infinite varieties and forms and physical aspects of nature. And then some of these, artifacts, some of these bits of information, the rocks or whatever, we might fashion them into cultural artifacts that we then, for example, wear around our necks or on our fingers. Or we might use them in prayer for countless other reasons. So humans then possess these brains then that allow us an incredible level of information integration, or something neuroscientists call phi. And with our brains, humans then have a relatively high level of phi, or integrated information, that we're able to process. Our dog or cat has phi too, but just a lesser quantity, as does a tree or a rock, less still. So the amount of information integration then that we're capable of reflects a certain level of awareness in our degree of consciousness. In that sense, then, a rock it just simply has a very low level of consciousness. And perhaps that's why some people like to insult others by calling them dumb as a rock. They presumably just have less phi than what might be expected in other humans. Anyway, the argument then suggests that consciousness itself is woven into the very fabric of space-time at different levels of organizational complexity. And so now we have arrived then at this crucial question. What happens to consciousness and the sense of self, or even our soul, if you will, when we die? Well, that's what we're going to consider and start to consider in the next installment, part 4 of this mini-series. And as ever, until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.